Well, when you hear of men and the topic of sex drive, it's usually a conversation about them having too much of it. Men have sex on the brain is the mantra you'll often hear. But new research by sexologist Elaine George suggests that's not necessarily the case. Elaine is currently undertaking a PhD researching men with low sexual desire, and she joins me on Life Matters this morning. Good morning, Elaine.
Good morning, Robbie.
Let's talk about definitions first of all, because what do you mean exactly by low sexual desire? There's lots of different men with, we're all very different in our own ways. But how do you define low sexual desire?
Well, Robbie, that's an excellent question because low sexual desire, if you like, was defined by the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which first came out in the 50s and there's been subsequent editions revised. And the most recent version was released in May this year, the DSM-5. HSDD, hypoactive sexual desire disorder, was what the term was used. But interestingly, it's just changed for women. They've changed it because they've removed the word desire, interestingly removed the word, because of the negative connotations. But for men, HSDD remains the same, which really identifies in a big way how little research has been done in the area of men, and one of the big reasons why I'm doing a PhD in the area for men. Low sexual desire, you've got a range of sexual desire in men and in women. And in men, it's been, as you said, the assumption is that all men have a robust drive and want sex 24/7. Some men do, but not all.
So what's the difference between desire and the ability to be sexually aroused?
Well, that is an excellent question again. Desire and arousal are inextricably linked. And again, there's been a lot of research done in this area. And more recently, in the 90s, there's a Canadian lady by the name of Rosemary Basson who proposed that desire doesn't necessarily need to precipitate arousal. It was always thought, the sexual response model was always thought to be linear, that you've got to have basically desire, then arousal, then your pleasure, then your orgasm, then resolution. She, on the other hand, has put forward a circular model which basically suggests that, and I'm talking now more in a woman's sense, but it applies equally to a man. But if a person allows himself to become aroused, then that will augment desire, and so it's a circular pattern that evolves. And that goes back to the notion that just not so much just lie back and think of the Queen of England, but just do it.
Right.
And this put a lot of women offside because this notion of just do it really kind of, up the ante.
Well, it philosophically grates fairly heavily too, doesn't it, for a lot of women?
Exactly. But and now coming back to men, is that if men are really exhausted at the end of the day, they're overwhelmed by fatigue, they're overwhelmed by stress. Again, some men may welcome sex as a tension stress reliever, but not all men. Some men just shut down and they go into their cave, so to speak. Now, if a man allows himself to become aroused, maybe, just maybe, this is a game where desire can kick in.
Are you suggesting, though, this is a more modern phenomenon? Because I would have thought that men and stress, particularly workplace stress, it goes back a long time, doesn't it?
Exactly.
So why are we only talking about it now?
Well, you see, this is what was fascinating because in the PhD, it's twofold. My first part has been doing some quantitative research. One, it was to explore the range in sexual desire in men over the past 6 months, not just the past month, but the past 6 months, because that comes back to what you compare previous literature and research with. Secondly, it was to explore some of the factors that contribute to a decline in sex or interest in sex over the past 6 months.
And was stress the overwhelming cause?
Exactly. Well, what was really interesting was a lot of factors that were put in there, things like relationship dissatisfaction, dissatisfied with your partner, fed up with your partner, partner's problems, not his. Yeah, and there were some funny responses, but they all hovered around the 20% mark. Men were able to indicate more than one response. And there was 337 men that participated in this research, so it wasn't just a small sample. And by far and large, the biggest factors that were indicated were stress and fatigue. Now, it warrants further research because, again, are stress and fatigue inextricably linked? And that in itself warrants further investigation.
And of course, it also increases the stress and tension in the relationship, doesn't it? I mean, going back to that circular argument.
Exactly. Rosie King was very well known for coming out with her pursuer distancer model. So the person that's wanting sex is pursuing the person that is doing the retreating.
And they're pushing them further away.
And what happens in the situation where the woman is pursuing the man for sex, it becomes difficult on a number of fronts. Difficult because women aren't conditioned to rejection, like to a certain extent men are. Secondly, women are brought up with the notion that all men want sex. So when her partner doesn't want sex, she starts to panic and she goes into a tailspin because she starts to think, well,
it's her fault.
It's her fault. Or is he turning gay? Or is he having an affair? So she gets really suspicious and this escalates the conflict. And her desperate attempts to create intimacy often backfire and ends up in more conflict.
So what's the circuit breaker that's needed in that situation?
Well, the circuit breaker that's needed is it's almost like a truce that's needed first of all. So both people need to sort of like back down and to understand and recognise what's happening. And, desire is an elusive term. I agree with you. That question that you asked about desire and arousal. And again, we don't really know. Firstly, as I said, the word desire has been dropped for women. It hasn't been for men. So we need to really understand, what does desire mean to men? Is it like a need under Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Is it like a hunger? Is it like steak that some men might want once a month and others might want it every day? And coming back to your question about what's needed between the couple, yes, it's a circuit breaker in the sense of a truce and a back down, but an awareness of, there's no right and wrong here. If somebody has a natural inclination to wanting to make love once a month, then so be it. I had a couple where he was quite happy with once a month and she was kind of jumping at the bit thinking, well, at least once a week would be more her preference. So it's then how you communicate that between a couple so she doesn't feel rejected and she doesn't get angry.
And should they be looking for a compromise?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It's always about compromise, but it's compromise in a way where there's not resentment. That's the key again, because when resentment builds, it can become toxic in the partnership. And I've seen couples where, I remember one couple where they were both 62, they'd been married for a number of years, they were grandparents, and it was really tweaking the emotional intimacy between them. It wasn't just all about their physical intimacy and the lack of sex.
Which is often the case, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
One drives the other.
Absolutely.
We're discussing low sex drive in men on Life Matters this morning. I'm joined by sexologist Elaine George today. You mentioned before that there's not a great deal of research in this area, but I also imagine there's not a great deal of discussion about this sort of topic. For men, it can often be, if not a shameful, certainly a slightly embarrassing area to have to own up to, isn't it? There's a macho culture for a lot of this area that men are supposed to be virile and they're supposed to be sexually driven. So how do you get men talking about this and, I guess, hopefully improving it too?
Well, excellent question, Robbie, because again, this is partly what drives me and makes me so passionate about the subject. But secondly, it's the biggest, Achilles heel and frustration because, again, the research has confirmed that embarrassment and, I guess, shyness and the fact that it is such a taboo subject tends to steer people away from seeking help. Of the number that were researched, only 75%, only 25% had sought the assistance of a GP was the number one person that people turn to.
What can a GP do in those circumstances?
Well, look, with credit to not taking away the role that GPs have in our busy lives, GPs are often the gatekeeper and play such an important role, yet their own time constraints prevent them from getting into the nitty-gritty issues of dealing with the relationship and more the dynamics and the factors that contribute to a problem with the desire discrepancy essentially in the couple.
And I also take it though that we sort of have to define erectile dysfunction and desire in this, don't we? Because a lot of responses might be just to prescribe Viagra or something similar.
Exactly. Look, I did some GP training last year and it absolutely I was flabbergasted at how many GPs are still reluctant to broach the subject or inquire about a man's sexuality. And that's with erectile function. That's with Viagra, Cialis and Levitra having been out now for over a decade. And so many GPs are awkward and reluctant to go there. And yet with the overwhelming stats showing that, metabolic syndrome, things like diabetes, things like obesity, things like hypertension, things like depression, and not to mention all the medications that often men are on to combat all those diseases, all has a massive effect on your sexual performance and also on your desire. So you've got a number of factors. This is the problem when, particularly with age, where you've got so many variables that all interact, and what's more significant than the other. It becomes, in some ways difficult to determine. But nonetheless, a GP plays a critical role, and I think there's still more education needed, but they play a critical role in assessing a man's sexuality, sexual well-being, and then being able to refer them onto a specialist. And erectile function, there is some comorbidity with sexual desire, which means that the two conditions exist. And a man, unfortunately, sometimes only needs to have one episode of where the penis becomes a bit flaccid, and then they panic themselves and think, oh, my God, I've got erectile dysfunction. And then that in turn will possibly contribute to a lack in desire because the man will pull back from his wife or partner.
So it can very quickly become self-perpetuating.
Exactly. But that's not all. I really want to stress that point, that that's not all.
You mentioned age, and age is always a factor in these things. Young men and men a few decades older tend to have different libidos and sexual desires, don't they? Is there a normal arc in that level of change? When I say normal with inverted commas.
There's two points here that I'd like to make. One is regarding limerence and the second is regarding testosterone. So I'll come back to the first one. Limerence is the romantic phase, the euphoric phase that people go through, whether they meet in their 60s or whether they meet in their 20s. And some people are serially addicted to, that 2-year high that they get with a new partner. But the reality is that that euphoric phase, the endorphins, all those feel-good chemicals do fade, and then the people wake up and think, oh, my God, so who have I married? Unfortunately, for the younger group, that often coincides with marriage, first baby and mortgage. So then they wake up and think, oh, my God. But, the reality is that 2-year period will fade. And equally, it does apply to people that get together in their 50s or 60s. But after that 2-year period, that's when people start to go into sort of some kind of normality, and that's where lovemaking might, go into a pattern of once a week, twice a week, whatever it is for that couple. And again, there's always going to be different stresses that come along, whether it's a baby, whether it's menopause, whether it's a death in the family, an accident, an illness, whatever. There's always going to be various variables that interfere with a person's sexual journey, if you like, in life. But coming back to age, testosterone will decline with men's age. And it is related to libido, but it's not the sole factor. There's been studies to show where men are eugonadal, which means normal testosterone levels, they can still be at the lower end of the desire spectrum. And one point I didn't make, and this has really come back in the research findings, which is what's exciting, is that the notion that all men want sex 24/7, yes, some do, but the research findings show that less than half expressed an interest in wanting sex every day. Just over a quarter wanted it 2 to 3 times a week, and then it tapers off, with some men reporting once a month or less. And that equates to about 15%, which then if we extrapolate that, it suggests that this problem, if you like, if we call it problem in inverted commas, affects 1 in every 6 to 7 couples. So
Which
it
is
is
a lot,
out there.
yeah.
It's a lot. It's out there.
So we should be recalibrating our expectations, our understanding of men's sexual desire around us?
I think partly it's a question of addressing this male macho image, this stereotypical male macho image and myth that all men want sex 24/7. The fact that, all men have a robust drive and should enjoy having sex and want to have it. It's a social sexual construct. It's not indicative of all men, even though we are led to believe that. I think it's a question that we need to really look at what is myth and then what is fact. And some men may not want sex 24/7, and it doesn't mean to say that they're not a real man. It doesn't mean that it has to erode their masculinity.
And of course, we should sort of combine, it mentions sex and intimacies. Sex doesn't have to, intimacy doesn't have to manifest in intercourse, does it? So maybe it's concentrating perhaps more on intimacy to begin with and then getting to the sexual side of things.
Absolutely. When I see couples where physical intimacy has dwindled for whatever reason, I always say to them that generally what happens is that the plug in the emotional tank it's seeped out, and what we've got to work on is rebuilding that emotional intimacy. And I always remember seeing a couple of few years back, and they were both really busy GPs. And interesting because they were medical people themselves. And she was absolutely appalled at the idea of scheduling sex. Absolutely, just completely appalled. Interestingly, they had 2 young children. Like many couples, they were very child-centric, running around at the weekends doing all these activities for little Johnny or Mary, and to the expense of couple time for them. So the thing that I really emphasise with couples is it's not so much about sex. Well, it is, but that's the icing on the cake, but it's couple time. People will negotiate some gym time, some golf time, some retail therapy, some me time in the pie, but very little is given to the couple, if anything. Often it's engaged with social interaction with other people, not so much couple time, couple activities.
So that's often the best first step to take is a little bit of that.
Exactly. And preferably not just the dinner scenario, because, that's too predictive. The candlelit dinner and all the rest of it. I read a joke earlier. It was sometime over the weekend. The secret to a long marriage is a candlelit dinner, a lovely glass of wine and all the rest of it, but the couple do it on separate nights.
You may have a point there. Elaine George, thanks so much for joining us this morning on Life Matters. If you're interested in perhaps contacting Elaine, you're still doing more research in this area, aren't you?
The next phase is to progress with some qualitative research, and if anybody is interested, it doesn't matter whether they want sex once a day or once a year, please feel free to contact me
we might be able
through the Life Matters.
Yeah, through the Life Matters website.
That would be great.
Be the way to go. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Good luck with it. Sexologist Elaine George, and a little discussion this morning on what she considers to be one of the best kept secrets in Australia. Maybe it's not for you. And that is low male sex drive.
RN, your world unfolding.